very much and welcome to everybody. I especially want to thank the Danbury News-Times and the Portuguese Cultural Center, our partners in putting on this debate. Without them and their great assistance, we wouldn't have this wonderful evening. I welcome everybody and I welcome your enthusiasm. I ask that we be civil and courteous to all the speakers, and please no heckling. Now I would like to introduce our distinguished panel who will ask questions of the candidates. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Chris Cook, Associate Professor of Political Science at WestConn. Chris is also the director of WestConn's Honors Program and was the founding coach of the Roger Sherman Debate Society, so you know a thing or two about debates. Sitting to Chris's right is Ruth Mendez. Ruth is a practicing attorney with Ventura, Ribeiro, and Smith, and she concentrates on personal injury law. Ruth is also very active in this Portuguese Cultural Center. She currently serves as vice president, so thank you, Ruth. Andrea is the Community and Government Relations Manager of Danbury Hospital. And Andrea, thank you very much for participating. Now I'd like to turn the procedure over to Art Cummings from the Danbury News-Times, and Art will explain the ground rules.
Thank you, Augie. On behalf of the News-Times and the Greater New Milford Spectrum, I would like to welcome the candidates, the panelists, and this great audience here tonight. It's a tremendous turnout. We are here tonight to hear the candidates who are running for the office of 5th Congressional District Congressman. And they're both outstanding candidates. We're very fortunate to have such a choice. To your right, Democrat Chris Murphy is a two-term incumbent congressman from the 5th District, serving in Washington. He's a former state representative for two two-year terms in Hartford, former state senator for two two-year terms in Hartford, and before he defeated Nancy Johnson in 2006 to become the district's congressman. Chris grew up in Connecticut, and he and his wife, Catherine Holohan, and their son, Owen, live in Cheshire. To your left, Republican Sam Caliguiri is a state senator now in his second two-year term in Hartford, and he is seeking the 5th congressional seat, trying to defeat Congressman Murphy. Sam served for 2 years as deputy legal counsel in the Connecticut governor's office. He was elected in 1997 to the Board of Aldermen in Waterbury, and 3 years later he became president of the board and later served a stint as acting mayor of the city. Sam is a lifelong resident of Waterbury, where he and his wife Lori and their two children, Grace and Owen, reside. Both these candidates have a son named Owen. Yeah, might be one of the few things. There will be 4 parts to tonight's debate. The debate will begin with each candidate making a 3-minute opening statement by coin toss, and all the order of the questions and statements was done by coin toss. Sam will go first, followed by Chris. Our panelists will then ask a total of 6 questions, 2 questions each, and Chris and Sam will have 2 minutes to answer each question and 30 seconds of optional rebuttal time. The third part of the debate will be a lot of fun. Each candidate will have the opportunity to ask 4 questions of his opponent, and the question can take up to 1 minute, and the response 2 minutes, and rebuttal time for the questioner of 1 minute. So each person will have two minutes for each question. And the final part of the debate will be the closing statements, which will be 3-minute duration from each of the candidates. Members of the League of Women Voters are kind enough to be keeping track of time for the candidates speaking here, and they're right in the front row, and They will be signaling with a 15-second placard, and then there'll be a time. Is there a bell tonight? Okay, we'll have a bell too. And I would ask the candidates, and I know both these guys are gentlemen, so I know they will honor the warning and the conclusion of the time. It's now time for the candidates to deliver their opening statements. Sam Caliguiri will speak first. Sam?
Thank you very much, Art. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here tonight at a very important debate in one of the most important elections we've faced, I think, in a very long time as a nation and as a state. Let me begin by thanking the League, the Portuguese Cultural Center, and the News Times for their sponsorship and support of this very important debate, and to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here, and to my friend Congressman Murphy for what I know is going to be another very spirited exchange. I want to take a moment to introduce my wife, Lori Caliguiri, who's here with us tonight. Danbury is an adopted home for me. Lori is born and raised here in Danbury. Her relatives came here to this community from Lebanon and Italy and built a great life for themselves over the course of many generations. Lori is the product of public schools here, including Danbury High School, and it would be a privilege and an honor for us to be able to represent this community in Congress. Lori, thank you very much for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm running for Congress because our country is heading in the wrong direction, and we need to get it back on track as soon as humanly possible. That starts by growing jobs again. People are getting crushed in one of the worst recessions we've experienced since the 1930s. Over 9% unemployment in Connecticut, double-digit unemployment in major cities throughout this district mean that people throughout the 5th District are hurting, and they're hurting badly. We need policies that will help us to start grow jobs again. Chris Murphy is a smart and capable person, and I like him. But his devotion to big government programs like the bailouts, the failed stimulus, and Obamacare have resulted in huge federal spending, record deficits, higher taxes, and fewer jobs. Chris Murphy and I may agree on the nature of the problems that we have to solve, but we disagree very dramatically on how to solve them. I believe there is a better way to solve the problems that plague us today, and it begins by bringing real fiscal conservatism back to Washington, D.C. I look forward to sharing that vision with you this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Chris Murphy.
Well, thank you very much, Art. Thank you to everyone assembled here today, and let me join my friend Sam Caliguiri in thanking the League of Women Voters, the News Times, and my friends at the Portuguese Cultural Center. Thank them especially because as an Irish politician I feel very at home being in a debate with a bar, and will make the evening a little bit livelier. Let me also welcome the most special person in my life, my wife, Kathy Holohan, who's joined us here today. Kathy, thank you very much for being part of this campaign. But I'd also like to introduce two other special people that are here. Those are my parents. My mother especially, because she, to me, represents the American dream. When her grandfather came to this country from Poland, he settled in New Britain, Connecticut, and he went to work in the factories of that city. And his son, my grandfather, went to work in those same factories. And they raised a daughter who, although she grew up in the housing projects of that city, was able to go to college, was able to raise a son who was led to believe that I could do anything that I wanted with my life, so long as I gave back to my community to try to reinforce that American dream that made my family. But after 8 years of government mismanagement, the American dream had been put at risk. I was sworn into office last January. This country was losing 700,000 jobs by the month, and we are on the brink of another Great Depression. Now, I'm proud to have been part of the effort to try to stabilize this economy and rescue it from the brink. Were those tough decisions? Absolutely. Did they entail the necessary leadership to be able to bring this country back from the precipice of depression? It did. But now that this country is stabilized, despite all of the hurt that is out there for families, the question is, where do we go from here? Now, Senator Caliguiri says we should fix the mess in a year and a half. Well, you can't fix 8 years of mismanagement in just 20 months. What we need to talk about is how we strengthen this country going forward. Senator Caliguiri would bring back the same policies that got us into this mess. He says it's time to change course, but he wants to go back to the days of less regulation for Wall Street, less protection against the outsourcers, and more tax breaks for the very wealthy. I disagree. People are hurting today, but the answer is to invest in education, not to cut it. To pass energy reform so that we create jobs, rather than using that issue as an excuse to score political points. And to start paying down our national debt rather than pursuing the same exact policies that created it in the first place. That's the choice, and it's a pretty important one. I'm excited to be here today, and I look forward to the debate.
Thank you very much. We will now have questions from our esteemed panel, and the first question will come from Chris Cook for Chris Murphy.
Yes, there is something else you both agree on as well, and that's the F-22 Raptor program. And one of my students actually did the research on this. He's here, Michael Roman. I had a competition for students to ask what I thought was the best question, and this comes from him. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, has recently stated in multiple interviews and speeches that, quote, "Our national debt is our biggest national security threat," unquote, and has raised concerns about the culture of spending in Congress, which often authorizes higher budgets than the Pentagon has requested. Given that, how do you both justify your support for the continuation of the F-22 program, a program which the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of the Air Force, and the Air Force Chief of Staff, among others, have all said is unnecessary? In other words, please explain why you both would vote for a military program that no one in the military wants. And if your answer is jobs, please explain why jobs in Connecticut are more important than resolving the biggest national security threat to the United States of America.
Chris, 2 minutes.
Well, that's exactly why I've spent a lot of the last 2 years working against unnecessary defense line items. There is absolutely waste and unnecessary expenditure within our defense program. It's why I fought against a $6 billion appropriation for an alternate engine to the new Joint Strike Fighter Force, something that no branches of the military asked for. Now, the F-22 is different. There is not the degree of unanimous support that the question necessarily suggests. The Air Force has said on repeated occasions that they think that they still need an investment in the F-22. And by listening to the Air Force, listening to the pilots that use those planes, I have supported that appropriation. But I absolutely believe that there is no way to tackle the deficit of this country without looking at the defense budget. One of the reasons that I did not support the war in Iraq was because this country could not afford it. Senator Caliguiri has said that he would have supported the Iraq war, says that he would have supported $1 trillion in spending cuts in order to pay for it. I think that would have had devastating effects on this country. This is a war of choice that put our country at greater risk, not less. And to pay for it by cutting programs like education or transportation or Medicare or senior programs to the bone would have exacerbated the situation. I've been very specific in this campaign about where I would cut spending. I've named the alternate engine as one of several programs that the federal government runs that I believe that we should start looking at for real spending cuts. An essential difference between Senator Caliguiri and I is that he would have supported the Iraq war, which added $1 trillion to our deficit. And he continues to be unable to enunciate any specific spending cuts in the defense budget or elsewhere that he would support in Washington. It's not a coincidence. It suggests that when he gets there, he'll do exactly what the Republicans have done for over a decade. Talk about spending cuts, but then do nothing about it.
Thank you. Sam, 2 minutes.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, but I disagree with the questioner because the Department of the Air Force says they need the F-22. And that's a critical difference, and Congressman Murphy said the same thing. The reality is, ladies and gentlemen, that the F-22 and the F-35, which is supposed to replace it, are designed to do two very different things, which is why the Air Force said we need the F-22, and the F-35 is not an adequate substitute for it. The reason why I think that's a very important point is because if there is any one single thing the federal government should be doing, it's protecting our national defense. And that starts by making sure that we have the absolute strongest, best equipped military force in the entire world. And we have to absolutely identify spending cuts and waste and inefficiency and programs we don't need whenever and wherever we can, including within defense. But ladies and gentlemen, when the Department of the Air Force says they need the F-22 to protect our national defense because the F-35 is not an adequate substitute for it, I'm going to side with the Department of the Air Force. Because ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, every aspect of our federal budget is about making tough decisions and tough priorities about how we're going to spend money and in what order. And in me, first and foremost, among the functions of the federal government is to protect our national defense. And having decided that we needed to go in Iraq, we needed to finish what we started, get it done right, and fund it to the full extent necessary to make sure that the lives that were lost there were not lost in vain. And that's why I will never support balancing our federal budget on the backs of our military, on the backs of our national security, on the backs of defending the American people.
Thank you. 30 second rebuttal. You each have an optional 30-second rebuttal if you'd like.
We'll move on.
We'll move on.
All right. See, they agree on something else. The next question will be from Ruth Mendez for Sam Caliguiri.
Good evening. Given the state and recent attention on public school systems, what would you do on a national level to ensure that the public school systems continue to properly serve the students who attend them?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here before you today because my parents came here as immigrants to this country. My dad from Italy, my mom from Canada. Neither had more than a grade school education. They worked in factories, in the case of my dad, almost his entire adult life. And for them, the American dream was making sure that my brother John and I had the very best education possible. Because America is one of those few places in the world where you can be born into any station in life. And because of a good, high-quality education and the opportunities that we traditionally have presented to people in this country economically, you can become anything you want to be. That's how within a generation I could be standing before you today as a state senator and as a nominee against such an esteemed person for the United States Congress. But it all starts by having a high quality education system. And in my judgment, the best thing the federal government can do to make sure we preserve public education in the United States is to not push one-size-fits-all solutions out of Washington, and to decentralize decision-making, and to take the power away from Washington and leave it to the states and local governments. Because we know in Danbury how best to educate Danbury children. Connecticut knows better than Washington how to educate Connecticut students. That's why I think No Child Left Behind was fundamentally flawed in the sense that it took a one-size-fits-all approach to trying to cram a single approach to education down the throats of the American people. So I think the federal government, in this case, serves education best by making sure it allows maximum flexibility to the states and at the local levels. And one final thought. When the federal government has put a mandate on states and local governments that have serious financial implications, like special education, then the federal government needs to make sure that it lives up to its financial obligations that it's imposed on the rest of us. Those are the two things I think we need to do from a federal perspective to keep public education strong.
I stand here as a result of our public education system. Not only did it give my parents a chance to realize the American dream, as it did for Senator Caliguiri's parents, I am a strong supporter of public education. And I frankly agree with Senator Caliguiri that the No Child Left Behind Act has been a disaster for many Connecticut school systems. It is absolutely the wrong thing to sit and judge Connecticut schools or Danbury schools from afar. It has labeled schools without giving those schools the resources or the tools to improve. And moving forward, though I certainly support accountability for our school system, we have to do much better than simply forcing one test down students' and teachers' throats and sucking all the creativity out of learning. Let's have a measurement of school performance that's much more robust than just one test. Let's measure curriculum. Let's measure teacher quality. Let's measure attendance and the graduation rates. There's a much better way to do this going forward. But let me tell you that schools here in Danbury are stronger because of the investments that we have made through the federal government in the last year and a half. If it were not for the American Recovery Act, which Senator Caliguiri over and over again says that has not worked, you would see class sizes balloon. You would see teachers laid off. You would see educational quality compromised. And the last thing that we should be doing is balancing the budget on the backs of American students. It is our one and single top strength as an economy. We may not be the cheapest place to do business in the world, but we still have the best quality workforce and the best educated workers in the world. And so I will stand up for the fact that the American Recovery Act has kept teachers on the job, has educated kids, and has invested in the most important strength of this economy, which is our educational system.
Congressman and I agree on education policy, but as for the stimulus bill, it was supposed to create 3.5 million jobs. We've lost more jobs than we've gained. It was supposed to keep unemployment at 8%. We're at 9.6% unemployment nationally. We're supposed to have a growing economy. We need 3% growth in GDP in order to keep employment levels the same. We're at 1.6% GDP. The stimulus bill was sold to the American people as a jobs bill. It's been a failure as a jobs bill.
Senator Caliguiri, you're wrong. The Congressional Budget Office has said that the stimulus bill, the American Recovery Act, has created or saved 2 million jobs in this country. Now, I want you to come to Danbury. I want you to listen to the mayor of this city, who said, God bless the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. You know why Mayor Boughton did that? The Republican nominee for lieutenant governor in the state? Because he knows the jobs that it's created or saved here in Danbury. He knows the difference it's made for people who have kept work and found work because of that bill.
Yeah. Thank you. Andrea Rynn will have a question for Chris Murphy.
Good evening, gentlemen. Prevention and access to primary care are foundational components to healthcare reform. If elected, what will you do to address a looming primary care physician shortage?
Well, thank you for your question, Andrea. Thank you for all of the great work that Danbury Hospital does here to serve the people of this region. I don't know what our healthcare system here would be without the great care provided by your hospital and by the doctors and nurses who work there. Listen, this country has buried its head in the sand for far too long. We think that people who don't have health care insurance don't get health care. Well, they do. They get health care at Danbury Hospital when they show up in the emergency room with conditions that have gotten past the point of saving, often costing our government and our health care system 10 times what it would have cost if we had just simply gotten preventative care to them in the first place. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world by a factor of 2 for a reason, because we have allowed 30 million people in this country to go without healthcare, but they get it. It just comes so late that it is crippling our system financially. Now, the reason that I support it, the healthcare reform bill, is because it seeks to correct that fundamental problem in our system. The fact that we are paying far too much for the people in this country who don't have health care insurance. The only way that we get preventative care to people is by getting them access to health care insurance. Now, Andrew, you bring up a very good point, which is that right now, we do not have enough primary care physicians to take care of the 30 million people who need health care insurance. We may have enough emergency physicians to staff the emergency rooms, but the reason why this legislation has to go into effect over a course of years is that we have to build up our primary care capacity. That's why the legislation invests almost $20 billion in building up community health care clinics. That's why it immediately raises rates for primary care physicians. That's why it gives loan forgiveness to medical students who choose to take on a career in primary care. This legislation is a historic investment in primary care, and it's a historic investment in preventative health care.
The best way to give people access to a doctor and to encourage preventative care is to start by repealing Obamacare, which is a disaster. And here's a very important point, and it goes right to the question that was asked. The Connecticut State Medical Society opposed the law because it said that it would increase patient loads by 7 to 20% when Connecticut doctors were already struggling to meet the patient loads that they were providing. This only exacerbates the problem. If you want to make sure that you have access to doctors, you need to make sure that you have a system that makes doctors still want to practice medicine. This one doesn't. You need to make sure that you have Medicare reimbursement rates that allow doctors to not take such a huge hit to their own economics that they don't want to be a part of the system any longer. So you need to make sure Medicare reimbursement rates are strong and remain strong so that doctors want to continue to be a part of the system. But from a macro perspective, you've got to create a system in which doctors actually want to be doctors, and this is going to create the exact opposite effect. When you combine this with the fact that because of this legislation, which Congressman Murphy didn't even think went far enough, we're seeing increases in insurance premiums in Connecticut by over 47%, justified almost in its entirety by the law that Congressman Murphy helped push with the support of Nancy Pelosi. How does that help prevention? How does that help access to doctors when it's putting such an enormous weight on the system that you have employers who can't even afford to provide it any longer because of skyrocketing rates? And the fact, ladies and gentlemen, is this is exactly part of what we were warned would happen. We need to do healthcare reform, but there is a much better way to do it than what Congressman Murphy supported in this law.
The Connecticut State Medical Society says that there is absolutely no justification for the 40% rate increase by Anthem Blue Cross, that there's nothing in the health care bill that would require that level of increase, and that this state should join the others that have rejected it. Now, Senator Caliguiri, I want you to look in the eye the man who showed up to my office with 3,000 signatures of cancer patients in support of this bill so it would finally allow people who are desperately sick to have access to health care. Tell him and the 3,000 others that joined him that that legislation that provides him with health care for the rest of his life is a disaster.
Yeah. I guess what I'd say is, Congressman, I'd like you to look in the eye every single American who works for a company who has decided that because of your law, sir, it makes no more sense for them to provide health insurance to their employees, that it makes more economic sense for them not to, which is going to have the result of pushing them into the very public option that you're desperately yearning for, and which will be a disaster for health care for all Americans.
Sam Caliguiri.
Yes, this comes from also the editorial page of our News Times today about jobs and candidates, and also my interest in the environment. Please tell me what your plans are, not what your opponent's plans are. This is for the both of you. What your plans are, not, and please don't categorize your opponent's plans, but what your plans are for creating more green jobs in Connecticut. Thank you.
Yeah. It's an excellent question, but my plan for creating jobs, green jobs, is the same as it is for creating jobs overall. And it starts by putting the fundamentals of a growing economy in place. Ladies and gentlemen, I start from the premise that the federal government doesn't grow jobs. What the federal government does is it puts policies in place that either make it easier for private enterprise to grow jobs or harder for private enterprise to grow jobs. And so my approach to growing jobs is making sure that as a Congress, we're always advancing policies that make it easier for the private sector to innovate and grow jobs, which is what they've always done best. Here's how I would do it. Make sure we reduce the federal deficit by getting spending back down to 20% of GDP, because the federal deficit is so large right now, it's counterproductive to economic growth. Second thing I would do, fully extend the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts for everybody, because extending it at the highest rate, ladies and gentlemen, is an enormous tax increase on a lot of small businesses, because most small businesses aren't paying the corporation tax. The third thing I would do is make sure we lower our corporate tax from 35 to 25. At 35, it's the second highest, ladies and gentlemen, in the industrialized world. At 25%, we'd be in line with the average around the world, thereby making us more competitive. The next thing I would do is make sure we reject job-killing legislation like the federal cap and trade bill that even President Obama said would result in electric bills necessarily skyrocketing. And then specifically for green jobs, I would use tax policy, research and development tax credits, and other tax incentives to encourage the private sector to develop new technologies and therefore new jobs in these arenas. But sir, nothing will help green jobs if we don't have the fundamentals of a growing economy in place.
I think the fact that Senator Caliguiri spent about 15 seconds actually answering the question shows that he has no plan for creating green jobs. So let me answer the question. I don't think the strategy is for the government to pick winners and losers. Senator Caliguiri talks about tax credits, but is still yet to be able to enunciate exactly what he's talking about, which tax credits he would pick, what technologies they would go to. I think we have to set an aggressive goal in this nation of reducing carbon emissions by 20% over the next 20 years, and then allow for the market to decide which technologies rise to the top. By setting an aggressive goal of carbon emission reduction, then you allow for the market to decide whether the investment goes into solar panels, into wind turbines, or into energy investment. And let me tell you that every other country in the world is eating our lunch on the issue of clean energy jobs. Right now, we have only one of the top 10 wind turbine companies, one of the top 10 solar companies, two of the top 10 advanced battery companies. Other countries are creating millions of jobs in these sectors because they are creating a domestic market for it. You have to give it more thought than just 15 seconds. This is an enormous growth opportunity for this nation. But it's more than just about jobs. Every time that we have politicians paying lip service to an investment in renewable, domestically produced energy economy, we're putting this country's national security at risk. Every day that we continue to pump our oil dollars, of which we consume 25% of the world's supply, into the hands of petro-dictators who very quickly transfer it to those people who are threatening this country with the next terrorist attack, we are compromising the national security of this country. We can't just do a tax credit there or a tax investment there. We need an aggressive transformational strategy to bring clean energy jobs to this country and to make this country truly energy dependent as a means of national security. Thank you.
Congressman, if you cared so much about green jobs flowing overseas, then you should have supported a stimulus bill that included $2.3 billion in tax credits for green jobs in China and other companies around the world. Those tax credits should have stayed here.
Senator Caliguiri, I'm the leader in Washington on making sure that when we send federal dollars to Washington, that it gets spent here in the United States. The only difference between you and I on this issue is that I objected to that provision of the stimulus bill. If you went to Washington, you would support the policies that would send our American jobs overseas. That's the critical difference between the two of us.
Thank you. And could I ask once again that everyone gives both these candidates the full and free opportunity to answer the questions? Thank you. The next question will be asked by Ruth Mendez of Chris Berkeley.
Again, this is a question as to what you would do and not what your opponent's position on this issue is. What legislation would you propose to keep companies here to provide manufacturing jobs in our country when they're being exported to countries with cheaper labor and less regulation?
It's hard for us not to talk about each other. We like each other so much. You know?
We really do, actually.
We do,
it's not apparent, but we do.
That wasn't a joke. Listen, I think that amongst all the differences between Senator Caliguiri, this is probably the most important. I believe that this country has a future in manufacturing. I do not think that it is inevitable that all of our jobs in that sector need to flow overseas. It's why I support repealing tax incentives for companies that ship jobs overseas. Senator Caliguiri has signed a pledge that he would protect those tax incentives for companies that ship jobs overseas. It's why I formed the Buy American Caucus in Washington, why I'm leading the effort to make sure that the federal government practices what it preaches, that when we send our money to Washington, that it gets spent on U.S. jobs. And Senator Caliguiri has had a number of different positions on my Buy America work. At first he supported it, then he opposed it, then he supports part of it and doesn't support other parts of it. I think we should be doing everything humanly possible to make sure that we grow jobs in this country. And that starts by making sure that the money that we send to Washington gets spent here in the United States. Senator Caliguiri sees that as protectionist. He doesn't think that we should spend at the minimum 60% of our taxpayer dollars on U.S. manufacturing. This is a critical and growing difference, it seems, between the two of us. It's also why I support targeting our tax policy to the small manufacturers and medium-sized manufacturers that are going to be the source of growth in this country. It's why I've supported $87 billion worth of tax cuts for small companies, including many small manufacturers. It's why I support a renewable energy policy that will create jobs right here in Danbury, at Fuel Cell Energy, which is poised for amazing growth if we give them the policy tools to do that with. Tax cuts for small manufacturers, renewable energy strategy, and a priority on spending our taxpayer dollars here in the United States will result in, I think, potentially incredible growth of our manufacturing sector.
Before coming here tonight, I met in Oakville with the Connecticut Small Manufacturers Association to ask them what's the thing we can do to make it easier for you to keep your jobs here, for you to grow, and for you to prosper. They said, number one, make sure you don't pass cap and trade, because it's going to send our energy prices through the roof. Because of all the energies, of all the industries, we're probably the most energy and electric intensive. Number two, make sure you keep our healthcare costs low. And by the way, they pointed to the 47% increases in health insurance premiums they're going to have to pay as an utter failure. The next thing they said is make sure that we're negotiating fair trade deals with our partners around the world. We believe in fair trade, but make sure that when we have a trade agreement, the other countries are abiding by the same rules so that they're not subsidizing products that end up being so low in cost, they're creating a harm to American companies. That's the third thing we need to do to make it happen. You know, Congressman Murphy likes to say that I don't support Buy American. I do. Buy American has been the law since the 1930s, and it was introduced by a Republican administration. What I oppose is Congressman Murphy's proposed changes to it, because even the Hartford Courant, ladies and gentlemen, in an editorial they wrote this weekend said that although well-intentioned, Congressman Murphy's proposal could spark a trade war and hurt states such as Connecticut that have a healthy export market. So it sounds good. It makes for a nice soundbite. It's a good club to use to beat me up, but it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And that's why the National Association of Manufacturers opposes it. And that's why anything that smacks of protectionism is ultimately going to hurt the very people we're trying to help. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to keep more jobs here by keeping the cost of business for doing business in Connecticut and the United States as low as possible, and making sure that trade is always fair along with free. Congressman Murphy has supported proposals that have made it more expensive for American companies to do business, not less expensive.
Well, I'm proud this week to have the Hartford Courant's endorsement in this race. And though I disagree with them on this issue, I'm proud of that. The fact is, we're already in a trade war with China. We're just the only one that's not fighting it. We've got to start standing up to the folks that are using unfair trade practices against us. And what Senator Caliguiri is talking about is my work to simply move from 50 to 60%, the minimum amount of our taxpayer dollars that are spent here in the United States of America. People think that it's outrageous that we are sending half of our U.S. taxpayer dollars overseas. All I'm seeking to do is increase that by 10%. That's something that everyone should be able to get behind.
Sam, 30 seconds.
Okay. Thank you.
And the final question from the panel will come from Andrea Rinn. And and that will be asked of Sam Caliguiri.
Hospitals are the healthcare safety net for their communities. In Connecticut this past year, only about 50% of our Connecticut hospitals operated at a profit. Some of the challenges and opportunities that face us going forward are changes to reimbursement rates, changes to healthcare system delivery and financing, changes to payer mix and insurance plan design. Additionally, we are being asked to collaborate on an extraordinary level in order to create an accountable care organization for this community and the patients that reside here. If elected, how will you work with hospitals, physicians, other clinicians, and even patients to shape what the future of healthcare looks like in Greater Danbury? And help hospitals and physicians meet these demands and challenges that reform may bring: financial, technical, care delivery, and other?
Well, that's an excellent question. And here's how I would do it. You know, you pointed to the fact that only about half of Connecticut hospitals are barely staying afloat. And the reason for that, ladies and gentlemen, is because the government, both the state and the federal government, has failed to live up to the financial obligations it's undertaken, especially under the Medicaid program. The hospitals that are suffering the most right now, Waterbury and St. Mary's in particular, and hospitals like it, are hospitals that have a high Medicaid population. And the reason for that is because the Medicaid reimbursement rates are so low here, because to reimburse at an even higher level would bankrupt a state that's already on the verge of bankruptcy. It's creating a huge amount of pressure on the deliverers of healthcare services. And that's one of the reasons why I think the healthcare bill that was passed this year was a mistake, because the primary way that it expands coverage is through the expansion of the Medicaid entitlement. And after 10 years, the federal government's going to stop paying the tab, and we in Connecticut are going to pay the tab. How are we going to ever do justice to that when we can't even live up to the obligation that we've made? So number one, we do it by making sure we don't take on additional obligations, like the expansion of Medicaid, that we know we can't afford and still have a growing economy. Number two is to make additional funding for Medicaid and making sure we protect Medicare reimbursement rates, an absolute top priority, as a way of making sure that docs and other providers are staying in the system. And third, we ought to be working with docs and other providers to allow for more of a continuum of care, so that we can change the silo approach to practicing medicine, where specialties tend to exist in a vacuum. And so one of the things that I think the healthcare law did right is to try to encourage the integration of healthcare horizontally, so that people are integrated among disciplines. That's something I would want to support, but I would rely on experts at the hospitals and in the provider community, and not on bureaucrats in Washington to do that.
I think you're seeing why a growing number of people are getting a little suspicious about Senator Caliguiri's claim that he's going to go to Washington and cut spending. So far today, he said he would support education funding at the federal level. He would support keeping Medicare at the same level. That he would support more money for Medicaid. Now, these are tough decisions that you have to make if you want to cut spending. Part of what the healthcare legislation did was restrain the rate of growth of Medicare by $500 billion over the course of 10 years. Now, that results in a reduction of the federal deficit by $130 billion over that period of time. Those are real cuts. Are they easy? No. Are they tough? Yes. But Senator Caliguiri can't continue to have it both ways. Support the spending that he likes, but still call for spending cuts when he gets to Washington. How we help hospitals is making sure that hospitals are not bearing the entire burden of crisis care in this nation. By insuring 30 million more people, we can shift the cost of caring for people from crisis care to preventative care. And right here in Danbury, we have amazing opportunities to do that. A new federally qualified community health center has opened up in the city in the last year, which will be able to care for 7,000 to 10,000 patients a year. I've been pleased and honored to work with John Murphy, the new CEO of the hospital, on a new accountable care organization for the Danbury area, as well as increased research dollars for the Danbury campus. Danbury is going to lead the way in moving this country away from a system of care in which we simply reimburse based on the volume of care to a system in which we reimburse based on the quality of care. if you want to talk about how we live up to the projections that CBO gives us of $2 trillion in savings to the national debt over the 20-year window of this bill, it's because of that transformation in payment away from volume-based care to outcomes-based care. And I'm proud of the fact that Danbury Hospital is leading the way, and I'm proud to be a partner with them in that effort.
Yeah.
I would just point out that the alleged savings to the deficit are a complete farce, because the Congressional Budget Office said that the only reason why the health care bill is actually showing a reduction in the deficit is because what the Congress did under Chris Murphy and Nancy Pelosi is strip out the Medicare doc fix. And if you actually put it over on the freestanding bill, then you can use budget gimmickry to say that the health care bill is going to actually reduce the deficit. When you put it back in, it's going to show a net increase in deficit of $95 billion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why I say I support the programs that I support is because the worst thing we can do is make a financial commitment that we don't honor. Having made it, we should honor it.
Thank you.
And I think the difference between Republicans and Democrats is often overblown by the media in Washington. But on this issue of raising rates for physicians, the difference couldn't be clearer. Over and over again, Democrats have tried to repeal a law passed by Republicans that enacts a 4% annual cut for physicians. It's a disaster. And time after time, the Republicans have stood in the way. On that issue, it's as simple as that the money being paid to doctors that they deserve and need is being held up by partisan politics in Washington. That needs to end.
The candidates will now have the opportunity to ask each other questions. And again, it's you have 1 minute to ask the question, 2 minutes to answer, and then the questioner gets another minute to respond. And Sam Caliguiri, you get to start.
Thank you. Congressman, if you're so proud of your record, why haven't you run a single ad touting the success of the stimulus, the bailouts, or Obamacare?
Senator Caliguiri, I am proud of the work that we've done to stabilize this economy. Does that mean that there isn't a lot more work to be done? Absolutely not. We encountered a situation in January of 2009 where we were losing almost 800,000 jobs a month. Now, I am absolutely proud of the tough decisions that we've had to make to stabilize this economy. I'm absolutely proud of, I think, the very difficult work that we've had to do to address some of the fundamental underlying problems, weaknesses of our economy, whether it be the spiraling cost of healthcare or the spiraling cost of energy policy. But there are clear differences between you and I in this campaign, and I think that the people of this state, the people of this district need to know them. That's why my advertising has focused on the difference between you and I on the issue of whether we're going to support manufacturing in this country. I absolutely believe that it's the right thing to do, to target at least 60% of the money that we send to the federal government on U.S. jobs. I frankly think it should be higher. I think it's disastrous that we have so many loopholes to that legislation. And I want voters to know the differences between you and I on that issue. I think the policies that you support with respect to manufacturing will cost this district thousands of jobs over the next several years. I think it's wrong to continue to give tax credits and tax incentives to the companies that are outsourcing our jobs. I believe that we should repeal those tax incentives and give them to companies that commit to create jobs here in the United States. That's a critical difference between you and I. And I'll absolutely use the remaining time that I have in this campaign to talk about the very real differences between you and I on the issue of protecting the jobs that built my family, the jobs that built many families in this room, manufacturing jobs.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a political campaign, candidates like to talk about things that they think are popular. And things are popular when people actually thought they worked and were a good idea. And I think the single greatest indictment of Congressman Murphy in his blind allegiance to Nancy Pelosi is that there's not a single ad that's run in the last 2 months that says the stimulus worked, Obamacare is a good idea, and the bailouts were a good idea. If they were so good, if the people thought they were such a great success, we'd be hearing all about it. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the ads have been about everything but the record of Congressman Murphy on these defining issues of our time, because they have failed by their own metrics, by their own standards, by the very results they promised us, and for which we have been left holding the bag.
Chris, get the chance to ask a question back.
Thank you. Senator Caliguiri, we're here in Danbury today. It's a community that I love, and I've loved to have served for the last 4 years. There are some very important projects here in Danbury that we've been working on collectively that we think are strengthening this city. I'll give you 3 examples. One is the Community Health Center that I talked about. An important addition to this city, which is going to serve thousands of underinsured and uninsured residents. A new early Head Start program that right now is serving about 60 children and about 90 families. And upgrades to the Danbury branch line, which is going to make better connections between our city and the central northeastern economic hub of New York. I'd like to know, Senator Caliguiri, if you are elected to Congress, will you continue to support these very important projects for the greater Danbury area?
Yes, but I will also go on to do the most important thing we can do for Danbury, and that's actually start grow jobs again. That is the central defining issue of this campaign. You know, I talked to Mark Bowden earlier today. I'm proud to have his support. I said, Mark, if there's one thing I can do to help Danbury, what is it? He said, make sure we have a strong, growing, thriving economy. Mark's done a great job. Only 7.9% unemployment here in Danbury. And that's a credit to Mark Bowden. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the big government, increased taxes, strangle you with more regulations approach that Chris Murphy and Nancy Pelosi have consistently advocated have made it nearly impossible for the private sector to grow jobs. That's why, instead of gaining 3.5 million jobs, we've lost more jobs than we've gained. That's why instead of having 8% unemployment nationally, we have 9.6% nationally, 9.1% in Connecticut, double digit in major cities throughout the 5th District. These aren't my metrics of success. These are the measures of success that Congressman Murphy and his allies in Congress set, by which we need to judge whether his ideas and his proposals are a success or a failure. They've been a failure. We need to take a different approach to make sure that we do the one most important thing Danbury needs: keep a strong, growing economy.
Mayor Bowden doesn't think those programs have been a failure because he supported the stimulus legislation because those 3 projects have grown over 100 jobs alone here in Danbury because of the investment from the stimulus bill. Early Head Start, investments in the rail line, and a new health center are here on the ground in Danbury creating jobs because of the stimulus bill. The policies that you support, the policies that Senator Caliguiri supports, are the exact same policies that got us into this mess in the first place. And Senator Caliguiri has to stop trashing the stimulus bill when Mayor Bowden himself will tell you that it has transformed people's lives here in Danbury, that it has grown hundreds of jobs, and it has prevented this economy here in the Danbury area from lurching into another depression. That's the reality of the situation here in Danbury that is very different than the rhetoric that Senator Caliguiri espouses.
And your question?
Thank you. Congressman, do you agree with me and over a dozen of your Democratic colleagues in the House of Representatives that it's time for Nancy Pelosi to be the Speaker?
Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama inherited the worst economy in...
Please give Congressman Murphy the opportunity to answer the question.
In a generation. Senator Caliguiri, every time that you use my name, you seem to attach it to Nancy Pelosi's name. We hear it over and over again in this campaign. Senator Caliguiri has voted with his Republican leadership in the state Senate 97% of the time as well. So Senator Caliguiri has to answer for his record of loyalty to his party. The fact is that the people in this district know who I represent. They know that I represent the hardworking manufacturers of this state and of this district. That's why I support Buy American policies. They know that I represent the middle-class families of this district, which is why I support targeting tax breaks to them rather than handing them to the wealthy. They understand that I support all of the families who have lost their homes in this recession, due in part to the reckless tactics of those that manage their money on Wall Street. That's why I support financial.
Ladies and gentlemen, please.
That's why I have supported a Wall Street reform bill that you oppose. The question is, who do you stand with? Who does Senator Caliguiri stand with when he supports more protections for outsourcers? When he wants to repeal a Wall Street bill that would seek to end the reckless behavior that got us in this mess in the first place? When he supports using $700 billion for a tax cut for people making $1 million a year, rather than using that money to pay down the deficit which is seeking to cripple this nation. People in this district know who I support. They know who I am with, and they're asking questions about who supports you and who you support.
I'll take your lack of a direct response as another vote for Nancy Pelosi. And here's why that matters. Here's why that matters. Ladies and gentlemen, I was the only senator and the only Republican in the entire General Assembly to stand up and say no to the 2007-2009 state budget because it violated the state spending cap and I believed was going to result in massive deficits, for which one newspaper called me the last sane man in Hartford, and another newspaper called me the lone defender of the state spending cap. In 2008, I was proud to be one of only 2 Republicans to stand up in support of increasing the minimum wage in Connecticut. Not a popular thing in my party. A governor of my own party vetoed it. I stuck to my guns and stuck with people because they needed that extra money. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Murphy has never been able to show that kind of independence. When's the last time he stood against his party on a vote of any real significance? I can't find it.
Senator Caliguiri, I stood against my party just this year in voting against the federal budget on the premise that I will not vote for another federal budget that doesn't cut the overall spending level for this country by at least 1%. I am absolutely willing to use my vote for that purpose. But Senator Caliguiri, you talk a lot about spending cuts. You talk about the fact that you would have supported the Iraq War and cut spending by $1 trillion in order to pay for it. I think people of this district deserve to know where that $1 trillion would have come to pay for a war that in the final analysis made this country less safe rather than more safe. I think we deserve answers today about why you would have supported the Iraq War, and more importantly, to start laying out exactly where you would have cut domestic services by $1 trillion. Not generalities, not platitude, but specific proposals on who would have been cut in order to fund this war.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by reminding you that there is no federal budget. For the first time in 35 years. For the first time in 35 years because of the failed leadership of Chris Murphy and Nancy Pelosi. That is an abomination. That is an absolute abomination. Second, don't put words in my mouth. I never said I would have cut spending by $1.3 trillion to fund the Iraq War. Those are words you've tried to put in my mouth, as you've done many times throughout this campaign. The point I was trying to make, ladies and gentlemen, is the point that I started with tonight. It's about priorities. And if there's a single #1 priority for the federal government, it's making sure that we protect our national defense. Having gone into Iraq, and by the way, just about every Democrat in the Senate supported it. Remember that. Having gone into Iraq, we need to finish the job. Which means that if you're going to do that in a way that takes the overall budget into consideration, you've got to make some priorities. But you can't balance this budget on the backs of our military. Now, I've talked a lot about specific cuts. And specific cuts include making sure that the $223 billion in unspent stimulus dollars don't become spent, because they've done almost nothing to grow our economy. It includes making sure we eliminate the pay raise for federal employees, which would save us $30 billion. It includes reducing government employment levels to 2008 levels, which would save us $35 billion. And it would include cutting wildly popular and profoundly important programs like the sleeper car subsidy for Amtrak, which would cost us $1.2 billion. We can talk this game through.
Chris, 1 minute.
Senator Caliguiri, I'm not putting words in your mouth. We can all go home tonight and go on YouTube and see exactly what you said. See that you would have supported the Iraq War and would have supported cutting spending by $1 trillion in order to fund it. Now, I tried to keep a running total of what you said there. Most of what you said was frankly not supporting new spending, not actually proposing any spending cuts. What I got to was maybe a couple $2 billion in total. What you're talking about necessitates a little bit more aggressive spending cuts than you've put on the table today, and it continues to exacerbate the disconnect between your rhetoric and what you have proposed in this campaign. You support massive new spending for the military to fund these wars. You refuse to enunciate large, significant spending cuts in order to pay for it. And this war did not make us more safe, Senator Caliguiri. This war did not advance our national security. This war simply emboldened the terrorists around the world who flocked to Iraq, who made it their cause celeb, and in the end has made this country less safe, not more safe.
Thank you.
Congressman, thus far you have 17 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives for your Buy American legislation. You like to claim that I don't support Buy American and I support outsourcing of jobs because I think your proposal is wrong, as does the Hartford Courant. But do you think the fact that the other 421 members of Congress, including many of your own party, who have not signed on as a co-sponsor of the bill, mean that they also support outsourcing jobs?
Well, Senator Caliguiri, I'm working on it. I mean, let's be honest about it. We have had almost a generation of leadership in this country which has supported and advanced policies that have sent our jobs overseas. I don't claim to have done everything that I wanted to do in the course of 3.5 years that I set out to do when I came to Congress, but I'm working every day to protect jobs in this country. I haven't proposed just one piece of legislation. I proposed multiple pieces of legislation, have passed multiple amendments onto appropriations bills to seek to keep jobs here in this country. I've started the Buy American caucus with Republicans and Democrats. Have I signed up every member of Congress? Have I brought every Republican and Democrat to my bipartisan group? No. But I'm fighting with every ounce of my being to keep jobs here. And I'm doing it not just when it comes to legislation in Washington, I'm doing it right here in Connecticut. When a company in our district that we both share said that they were going to send 1,000 jobs out of this state, Pratt & Whitney, I called up those workers immediately. I joined a fight that included Governor Rell and every member of the state legislative delegation for Cheshire. Senator Caliguiri never called those workers, didn't come to any of the meetings. Yes, he signed one letter that I sent around to the delegation. But in the end, fighting for jobs is not just about working your tail off in Washington to support pro-manufacturing policies. It's also about doing the work here in Connecticut to support workers when their jobs are on the line. Our record is very different on the issue of Buy American. I'm not sure what your position is because it seems to change from day to day. And though I have a lot of work to do on this issue, I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to rest one day until I protect every job that I can for American workers. And I'm not going to stop fighting for the companies in my district and the workers in my district who need help. That is another difference between you and I. It's not just about pursuing policies in Washington that make sense. It's about fighting for workers here in the state of Connecticut.
I think really, and Pratt is a prime example, that the fundamental difference between Congressman Murphy and I is that I'd rather fight on the front end to put policies in place that prevent Pratt from deciding it's in their economic interest to move jobs elsewhere. Congressman Murphy, on the other hand, would rather yell and scream and go to a rally after the policies that he's promoted have had exactly that effect.
I'm going to do both. I'm going to fight for the front-end policies, and I'm going to go yell and scream when they try to... So let's stay on this topic then. Senator Caliguiri, why do you think that it's bad policy, and we're trying to narrow down the difference between you and I on the issue of Buy American, because it does seem to shift. Why do you think it's bad policy for us to say this simply, that at least 60% of the money that we send to Washington should be used on U.S. jobs? Why is 60% too much to ask when it comes to using the hard-earned money of American taxpayers to be used to pay for the hard-earned work of American workers?
Actually, that's not a bad idea, but that's not what your proposal does. What your proposal does has two parts to it. The first is financial assistance to U.S. manufacturers to help them make sure they can develop products here in the United States so that under our Buy American laws, there isn't an excuse for the federal government to go overseas to get those products. I think that part of the program is a good idea. But the second part of Congressman Murphy's proposal would gut one of the four major exemptions to the Buy American laws. And that is such a profound change that the National Association of Manufacturers have said it's a bad idea because it would provoke retaliatory trade action. And let me give you a prime example. The stimulus bill had a steel tariff in it. It didn't even amend Buy American. All it did was supersede Buy American for purposes of that one narrow thing. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce said because of that proposal, U.S. companies stood to lose 177,000 jobs. Canada, our largest trading partner, threatened retaliatory trade action against American companies. That's why it's a bad idea, Congressman. When you put it the way you put it, it all sounds mom and apple pie. But when you ask the experts and you ask the people on the front lines, what they'll tell you is American manufacturers are going to be hurt. They're going to be hurt because our trading partners around the world are going to punish American companies with retaliatory trade actions. And going back to our last exchange, guess what's going to happen? You'll hear Congressman Murphy yell and scream again and go to a rally. But those jobs would have flowed out because of his policies. And that's why I'm not afraid to take what isn't the most popular position in the world, but which in my judgment, on the merits, and in the judgment of experts like the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, say it's a disaster.
1 minute.
Senator Caliguiri, I don't listen to trade groups in Washington, D.C. I listen to trade groups in Connecticut. I listen to manufacturers here who have said loud and clear that we need to strengthen Buy America jobs. 70 jobs at a manufacturing firm in Waterbury are going to be lost unless we strengthen those jobs. And if you understood World Trade Organization rules, you'd know that there is an exemption in all of our trade agreements for policies that protect defense domestic manufacturing work. That's the current law on the books. Now, we do need to start closing up these loopholes. In the last year of the Bush administration quadrupled the number of waivers that it provided to the Buy American law. These waivers have become the size of Mack trucks that companies are driving through in order to offshore thousands of jobs. I'm willing to stand up to those companies to reinforce our Buy America policies. And that's not protectionist, that's not a violation of the WTO, that's just a smart use of taxpayer dollars.
One more question each, and the question belongs to Sam.
Thank you. Congressman Murphy, how do you look at yourself in the mirror in the morning when you run ads against me that are so despicable that even the Republican American said in its editorial this Sunday that you are a deliberate liar?
Poor guy. Poor guy.
Senator Caliguiri, the Republican American has never been a great fan of mine over the years. But Senator Caliguiri, if Senator Caliguiri wants to be so critical of my record in Washington, D.C., then he has to be prepared to defend his record as well. I do have disagreements with your record in Waterbury. I think that the reason, in part, why the state of Connecticut had to come in and bail out the city of Waterbury's finances was because of a decade of fiscal mismanagement that you had a big role in, when decisions that were tough had to be made in that city, either to cut spending, to address pension liabilities, or to reevaluate property tax valuations. You didn't make those decisions. And so what ended up happening was that you engineered a 20%, $10 million tax increase on the citizens of Waterbury, including homeowners and small businesses, which didn't even fix the mess because the state of Connecticut had to come in and clean it up. I do have a disagreement with the decision you made with respect to former Mayor Giordano. Again, I think it exhibits an unwillingness to take a tough path that may be the right path. I know you're very sensitive about the work that you've done in the city of Waterbury. It is a great city, but it was mismanaged under your leadership for far too long. There were tough decisions that needed to be made there that weren't. And that is what I've talked about in my advertising.
When I was done with my tenure in Waterbury, the Hartford Courant wrote an editorial saying that I served with distinction. Their words, not mine. In the most recent current editorial of my friend Congressman Murphy, they said, I served the city ably and have navigated very tough situations during one of the darkest chapters in the city's history. But none of that goes to the ultimate and profound fact that I personally would be mortified if a newspaper went so far as to call me a deliberate liar. And that's what Congressman Murphy isn't addressing. And ladies and gentlemen, when we go that far down the road of not talking about the stimulus, the bailouts, Obamacare, and talking about stuff that people call a deliberate lie, we've gone a long way from anything that honors this democratic process.
I'll just note, Senator Caliguiri,
sir, thank you.
Senator Caliguiri, I'll just note that it was okay with you when many of your allies went on TV and said that I supported giving Viagra to sex offenders. And so many people in this district are still waiting for you to stand up against the lies that your allies have perpetuated. Senator Caliguiri, I know that we do disagree on a lot of issues, but let me ask you about one in which I had hoped we would agree. When you were in the state Senate, why were you the deciding vote to kill a bill that would have stopped insurance companies from discriminating against women and charging them higher rates simply because they're women?
Let me start by going back to the former point, and then I'll answer this question. The Congressional Research Service confirmed in a memo on Wednesday, April 5th, 2010, that rapists and sex offenders may get federally subsidized Viagra and other sexual performance-enhancing drugs under the recently passed health care reform law. There you go, Congressman. Your own congressional. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I was the author of the law in Connecticut to strengthen the equal pay laws in Connecticut for women. And I teamed up with Senator Edith Prague, a liberal Democrat from Eastern Connecticut, in getting that law passed because it's a matter of fairness and a matter of justice. But the law that Congressman Murphy referred to is something that, as the ranking member of the insurance company, all of the insurance company...
Got it right, got it right.
Of the insurance committee, all of the experts came before us and said that if you made that radical a change to the underwriting standards without fully understanding the impact, you could result in an enormous spike in the cost of private insurance in Connecticut. And until I was ready to fully get my hands around what the actuaries said the impact of that policy change would be, I think it would be irresponsible to support it.
There's some things that are just right and wrong. It is just wrong to allow insurance companies to charge women more for health care simply because they are women. Being a female should not be a pre-existing condition in this country. And that is a critical difference between you and I. Senator Caliguiri, the Washington Post called that ad an outright lie. They are now running one on TV that says that the health care bill will jail anyone who doesn't have health care insurance. That's an even more outrageous lie that the Washington Post also called an outright lie. It's time for you to step up to many of your allies, whom we don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
These ads are being run by some shadowy, anonymous group that won't stand up for themselves in this campaign. Folks, in this campaign. It's time for you to join numerous publications that have evaluated these ads and call them out for what they are.
Yeah.
Thank you. We will now conclude the debate with 3-minute closing statements, and Congressman Murphy, you go first.
Well, again, thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you to my family. Thank you to Senator Caliguiri's family for joining us here today. A couple months back, I went door to door, as I do most times I'm back. I met a guy at a door in Torrington, Connecticut, and he told me his story. He told me about how he had gotten injured, and because of his injury, he had lost his job. And in losing his job, he also lost his health insurance. The bills had piled up, and he had to make a decision. Do I continue to pay my mortgage, or do I start to deplete my son's college savings account? He sat down with his family, and in the end, his son said, "Don't worry about it, Dad. I'll go to work. I'll try to save as much as I can. Let's stay in this house." Change is not easy in this country. There are always going to be more people that stand up for the status quo than stand up for that change. But that situation and that question should never be confronted to a family ever again in this nation. Now, Senator Caliguiri says that we should change the course as well in this country. But the alternative that he asks for is simply a return to the same policies and the same discriminatory practices that got us into the mess that we're in today. If you like the place that the economy is in today, if you like the place that became the result of 8 years of economic malfeasance in this country, then Senator Caliguiri is your candidate for the United States Congress. Because he'll go to Congress and repeal the Wall Street reform bill, putting our money back at risk of reckless speculation. Because he'll run up another $11 trillion of deficits by passing tax cuts without actually cutting spending. It's not a coincidence that he continues to not be able to account for the full spending cuts necessary to pay for the policies that he proposes. And as you have heard over and over again, he will continue to empower the very companies that are shifting our jobs overseas. If you like the way that our country looks now, then Senator Caliguiri will go to Washington to put back into place the exact same policies that got us here. I want something different. I want a government that's smart enough to know that it is pound foolish to deny health care to people and force them to get much expensive care at the emergency room rather than investing in preventative care. I want a government that stands up to outsourcers and spends our taxpayer dollars on U.S. jobs. And I want to pay down this deficit, both with real spending cuts and targeted tax relief to the middle-class families who are most likely to put that money right back into the economy. And I want a government that's sensible enough and compassionate enough to know what a disaster that it would be if we use this election to return this country to the exact same policies that got us into this mess in the first place. It has been the honor of my life to be able to represent Danbury, the surrounding area, in Congress. I thank you for your support over the years, and I ask for your vote this coming Tuesday.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all again very much for being here and for your active participation in this debate. And I want to thank Congressman Murphy for another excellent exchange. Ladies and gentlemen, only in Washington, D.C. can you have been in Congress for 4 years and somehow blame this guy who's never been in Congress for the mess that we're in today. Because that's what you're just heard. It's absolutely astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no more place for Congressman Murphy to hide. They've been in power. They've had it all to themselves. They've controlled it all. And by their own standards and by their own metrics, our country is heading in the wrong direction. We have nearly 10% unemployment nationally. 9% in Connecticut, double digits in major cities throughout Connecticut. People are going through one of the worst recessions in 30 years. I believe, and the reason why I'm running for Congress, is the big government, high taxing, more regulation approach that Congressman Murphy has consistently and blindly supported have done us more harm than good. We need to get the economy growing again, but I believe there's a very different way to do it. And you do it by reintroducing in Washington real fiscal responsibility, which means getting federal spending under control, which starts by making sure the stimulus doesn't become a permanent part of the federal budget. That $787 billion did almost nothing to grow our jobs, and it has only grown the size of the federal government. And then we need to put tough, enforceable spending caps in place on the entire federal budget as a way of making sure that both parties, no matter who's in charge, and frankly, the Republicans were every bit as guilty as they used to accuse the Democrats of when they started spending every bit as much as the Democrats used to. And that's why I support tough, enforceable spending caps as a way of forcing both parties to get spending under control. But then you have to do the one thing that every economist agree is the real time-proven stimulus of the economy, and that's to keep tax rates low. That's why we've got to make sure we fully extend the 01 and 03 tax cuts, because guess what? That way you and your businesses get more money in your pocket to pursue your family's dreams, to pursue your business's growth and development. How in God's name does it make sense to take $20 billion out of the American pockets, bring it up to Washington, D.C. for infrastructure improvements, and 20 months after it was passed, it's nowhere to be found? That's the inherent inefficiency of Washington, D.C. Mine is a very different vision. Get spending under control, put tough enforceable spending caps in place on the entire federal budget, make sure we keep tax rates low, repeal Obamacare, which is a disaster, make sure federal cap and trade never sees the light of day, and take the burden off the backs of the American public and American business. That's how we're going to grow jobs again. That's why I need your vote and your help on November 2nd. Thank you very much.
Being here tonight and for articulating your views. I'd like to thank the panelists for your excellent questions, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. Augie Ribeiro would like to make some closing comments.
Thank you this evening for respecting the house here at the Portuguese Cultural Center. Thank you for respecting the process. It's enjoyable. Thank you for your support. Thank you for the candidates. And again, please continue to support your communities, just like this, a not-for-profit Portuguese Cultural Center. Thank you again.